welcome everyone to the last panel of the day, and we are more or less following the conversation from the former panel, because in this panel we will be discussing autocratization tendencies in sub-Saharan Africa, and we will be talking about our project, which is more or less coming to an end. Well, we have another few months or almost a year thanks to COVID, and the project is then the project that the Bergen Exchange's audience have been following for many years, because it was a project we started in 2017, and it's called Breaking Bad, Understanding Backlash Against Democracy. We are in a kind of wonderful stage of actually more or less wrapping up the project. So we have something to say, I think. I will. And we have made a decision, because we are a big research group, and we're lucky enough to have many of us physically present in Bergen. And so we decided to do, a physical panel. And I don't know, but greetings to our friends who unfortunately could not be here, our friends in Africa, project members in sub-Saharan Africa, project members in the US, and one project member in Oslo, who is actually on her way from the US. So today we are going to discuss this tendency of autocratization and this democratic backsliding and the resilience to democratic backsliding in sub-Saharan Africa. And everyone here will be talking of particular aspects of the project that they have been working on specifically. And if this conversation excites you, we also have something to tell you, that there is a book coming out, and in Oxford University Press. We will be delivering our manuscript now in September, and so by the Bergen Exchanges next year, we will have physical copies of the book. So that is what we are going to be talking about today. So this project, Understanding Backlash Against Democracy. What are the drivers of autocratization? But what are also the drivers of the resilience towards it? What are the factors that are sort of maintaining democracy in the threats of autocratization? That's the kind of dynamism we have been looking at. As we all agree in this room and in the Bergen Exchanges, democratic backlash is something incremental. It's slow. It is not like rapid coups as 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's slow, it's incremental, and very often it happens through law. Secondly, it doesn't hit every aspect of democracy and all democratic institutions equally. In many instances, and we will be talking more about that, we see that electoral institutions are maybe less hit, whereas NGOs, gender rights, rights to information, and legal institutions are often more hit by the sort of autocratization tendencies. So that's also something we actually need to sort of disaggregate what elements of democracy that has been threatened. Also, we find in our project that we don't really see, I think they sort of coming with a conclusion already. For the continent as a whole and for the countries that we've been studying, we don't see any wholesale democratic backlash. We see threats and we see attacks on democracy, and we see a form of resilience. So we see these back and forth. And maybe the main story for us is that democracy more or less stagnated in the early 1990s, the way it sort of entered and the way it transformed in the democratic transitions in the 1990s. And it has never really become like constituted or institutionalized, or is sort of improved tremendously, or actually sort of backslided tremendously. It is this sort of, it's sort of a truce or a stagnation. Now that sounds like nothing has happened, which is not the case, because it's exactly this back and forth powers that are threatening democracy, the incumbent forces trying to threaten democracy, and then the forces, the resilient forces. And this is exactly this interface between opposition, civil society, and the law and legal institutions and incumbent forces. And that is our narrative, and that's our story. To us, the drivers of this truce, that is basically kind of an ongoing debate and a war, happens through two mechanisms. And the one mechanism is really the law, or what we call legal mechanisms. And Siri will be talking a little bit more about how we have defined and how we've used this legal autocratization, as we heard in the former panel. And the other mechanism that is super important for us and for the countries and the continent that we are talking about, maybe more so than many others, is the international mechanism. Because the African continent and the democratization processes has really been advocated and some in large aspects financed by international forces and international donors. But that is also changing rapidly, because there's a clear backlash within the donor community against, democracy promotion. And you have new forces. China is becoming a much more important actor. And so these changing international mechanisms are also clearly affecting our project. So in our book, we will be doing exactly that, sort of describing how these mechanisms work towards the sort of autocratization and resilience mechanisms. And we will be describing this in 4 theoretical chapters. First, introducing the project, then describing democratic participation, then the legal and the international mechanisms, and then 6 country cases. And today, in this beautiful panel with my great friends, we will be talking about various aspects and, various thematic aspects of this project. And pretty much everyone here has been given a pretty free rein of what to talk about. So what I will do, when I shut up, which is very soon, I will give the word to Caroline Bjelland. And Caroline has just, a month ago, completed her master thesis, which is written on Zambia and the role of the Pentecostal churches in the democratic backsliding that really has been going on in Zambia, with a very nice silver lining today that Caroline will be talking about. From Caroline, we will go to Siri, and then I will step down, and Siri will explain a little bit more about the legal mechanisms. Then we'll go to Vibeke Wang. Is that okay? We'll do it that way. And who will be describing the attacks on gender and women's rights, but also the resilience of the gender rights. Moving then to Matthew, he's going to surprise me, because we had 2 things that he may talk about, which are, but I do suspect we will again be talking, I hope at least we'll be talking about gender rights and the attacks on LGBT rights, but we're pretty free. Last on the line is Lise Marie, who has almost finished her PhD. We are like in the finishing stages of all. And Lise Marie has been working very closely with the NGO laws and the attacks on civil society, and also civil society resilience. And just now been part of a special issue coming out of the Breaking Bad group on how democratic backlash has affected civil society and also the resilience from civil society. So that will be your presentation. So with no further ado, or a lot of further ado, I will switch places with Siri, because we can only be, because of this, whatever rules, we can only be 5 here. And then floor is yours.
Yeah,
Caroline.
Okay, thank you. So Zambia was among of the many countries on the African continent that was part of the third wave democratization processes in the 1990s. However, like many of these third wave democracies, alternation of power did not necessarily lead to liberal political norms or supporting institutions that is important for democratic consolidation. Broadly speaking, democracy in Zambia is challenged in many ways, where freedom of assembly, speech, and association, and the right to private life is under threat. And as Lise mentions, much of this chipping away of democracy happens through legal mechanisms. For example, after the 2016 election, the Patriotic Front government sought to undermine the capacity of concerted action by civic groups on key subjects such as constitutional reforms. And by relying on the introduction of the Public Order Act, a colonial era legislation which regulates and in many ways hinders peaceful protests. And the alternation in Zambia has not been as regular as one would expect in healthy democracy either. Once in power, incumbent leaders seem to hold on to that power. The movement for multi-party democracy party, which was elected after the transition in the 1990s, reigned from 1991 till 2011, so 20 years. And the party that succeeded, the Patriotic Front, has been in power from 2011 until 2021. However, as Lise mentions, there's a silver lining just happened. On Thursday, Zambia went to vote for between the incumbent leader, President Richard Lungu from the Patriotic Front, versus Hakainde Hichilema from the United Party of National Development. And today he was, President Richard Lungu actually conceded, and the presidency was given to Hichilema. He was announced the next president of Zambia. And it seems like Zambians have been ready for a change for a while now. I heard an interview with a woman who said she'd been standing in lines for 6 hours and was ready to stand in line for 6 more hours. And something tells me you don't stand in line to vote for the sitting president for that long. And the Electoral Commission of Zambia even allowed the last polling stations to remain open until 5 a.m. on the Friday to allow the people who've been standing in queues for hours to vote. So there's kind of this euphoria almost that we saw during the 1991 democratic transition is happening again. And the election was expected to be a close race, but Hichilema actually won by quite a landslide. Although President Lungu tried to pull the trump card and said that the election was rigged against his party, calling it unfair and unfree, he today conceded, which is very good news for the democracy of Zambia. And also, something that's quite important and has been quite important is also, although the incumbent government has portrayed this narrative of the election being rigged and unfair, and has said that violence has happened against the supporters of the Patriotic Front, we have reports from monitoring actors who have portrayed quite a different image. Here, the churches, and especially the Catholic Church, has since the early 1990s been important actors in facilitating democratic processes and have in many ways acted as government watchdogs. And during this election, the Christian Churches Monitoring Group, CCMG, which is a collaboration of all the churches in Zambia, have sought to monitor the election processes. And in their latest report, they identified or observed that there was twice as much violence instigated by individuals affiliated with the PF as those by the UPND. And the UPND also reports that leaders have been, there have been incidents of violence against their leaders. However, this has received less attention because they have not been amplified by the state media. The CCMG also reported that there was a limiting of campaign space due to the Public Order Act, as mentioned, and also due to COVID restrictions, with almost all of these incidents resulting in the limitation of the campaigning of the UPND. So yes, there has kind of not been a fair election, but not the way that the President Lungu has tried to portray it, maybe. This also shows how important the church is in politics in Zambia and what role it plays, and also how important the church-state relationship is in Zambia. And the Patriotic Front and Lungu's government has drawn heavily on the Christian language throughout their presidency. And this is not surprising, as Zambia is heavily Christian, with 95% of the population identifying as Christian. And Zambia is also Christian by political decree, being the only African country who was declared a Christian nation. Which brings me closer to my master thesis, which, as Lise mentioned, wanted to look at how the church, or the Pentecostal church, more specifically, what role they play in politics and how also they influence political values. And at first glance, the Pentecostal church in Zambia may seem to fit into this category of a watchdog church, similarly to the Catholic and other mainstream churches in Zambia. However, although the Pentecostal movement and the Pentecostal churches were important actors in overthrowing the one-party rule in the 1991 democratic transitions, the political trajectory of leading Pentecostal clergy indicates this shifting attitudes towards liberal democratic practices. And Pentecostal leaders have instead become quite divided in their political stand, and many have been silent in the midst of corruption, which has much to do with the way they view politics. Because for many Pentecostals, or according to Pentecostal leaders, the president is not only chosen by the people, they're also chosen by God. And so they've been quite supportive of the government of the day, because then they're also supportive of what God has chosen. And this government's appeal to the country's Christian status, being a Christian nation and almost, being in close contact with the Pentecostal clergy and church clergy, has also been a way of whitewashing corruption in a way. So in a way, we see like this is a drawback, and also it leads to kind of a backslide against democracy. And President Lungu has President Lungu has in many ways sought to win over the Pentecostal vote, and have worked closely with Pentecostal leaders and appointed some to government even. However, this election, and I wish I was writing my master thesis now, it's been a shift. One of the most influential tele-evangelists and Pentecostal clergy, Joe Imakando, who's also been a very strong supporter of President Lungu, have right before the election withdrawn his support to his presidency, and also prophetically called his voters to not vote for the incumbent leader. This was not received well by President Lungu, who also sent a cabinet minister, Reverend Sumaili, to demand an apology from Imakando. And this incident shows how important the relationship is between church and church leaders and the state, and for the incumbent leaders to hold on to power. And it also quite showed the ambivalent role that the Pentecostal church have on elite level, at least, and how, the ambivalent role they have in the realms of politics and democracy. On one hand, during his presidency, the Pentecostal clergy have been more outspoken about their support for the president, because we support the government of the day. But now with the election, it seems like it's time. They were outspoken about people needing to vote in another leader, but also perhaps because they thought now God can help us vote for another leader. So that it has this both negative and positive impact on democracy in Zambia, which is very much in line with what Lisa and the others are finding in their books as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Caroline. This is great. Thank you. And like I said, very, very fresh. This happened this morning, actually, the incumbent president conceding that he'd lost the election. So this is really fresh news. Stuart, take us through the legal mechanism.
Thank you. First, I must say that your story was so interesting and it was so well told that I was keeping my breath. So now I just need to get it back. But this was amazing. It was really, really, really. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes. So as Lise was saying, we have been looking at how the law has been leveraged in the African context, and it's not new. I mean, this is something that has been going on in very many of these countries since liberation, at least. That governments are leveraging the law in different arenas and in different ways, and not only the government. But we start with looking at the government. And in this context, we've been using the term autocratic lawfare, looking at how the law has leveraged, the government has leveraged law, both in the legislative and constitutional domain, changing the constitution, changing laws in different ways. And of course, the constitutional lawfare is what Ruth was also talking about this morning, entrenching things in the constitution, amending the constitution in different ways that help the government stay in power. And in particular, changing the term of the presidency has been a common way of trying to entrench power in these contexts, but also changing regulations or legal or even constitutional provisions on floor crossing, for instance, how you can change parties. So there are different ways in which the constitution has been leveraged. And then, of course, a lot of laws, using laws like NGO laws that we've been talking about, media laws, in many different types of laws, both in terms of new laws, but also, and then we move into the second domain, which is not the legislative domain and constitutional directly, but more the administrative domain, and using the discretion then the interpretation within the law that the administration can use in order to, for instance, leverage old laws. You were talking about public order acts, but you can bring them back. You can bring back laws on sodomy that have been sleeping, and then you can bring them back and make them active. You can bring back laws on, or you can use laws more harshly or selectively on criminal libel, for instance, laws against criticism of the president. There are many different ways in which you can change the law without changing the law. You can also, the law on the books, you can change the law in practice. And you can also use discretion with regard to appointments, and we see that a lot. So you can, for instance, not appoint judges. You can just let them be for a while, empty. You can appoint because there are restrictions on who you can appoint as judges, and often that is followed. You might just leave it empty for a while, but you can also, of course, leverage that. But you can also appoint members of human rights commissions who are really, really your people, and will not provide any watchdog function, but the opposite. So this sort of discretion and an administrative function is used by all governments everywhere, but it's used very actively by many governments. And of course, you can also decide that the law is to be interpreted in a particular way. And we see that in Norway as well, of course, when the government wants the immigration or asylum laws to be interpreted in a particular way. So these are not unique, but they're very common. And then, of course, you can use the courts. And the government can use the courts both by sort of reining in the courts, as in terms of appointments and so on that I already talked about. But you can also use the courts, even if they're quite independent, you can use them for your own purpose. And one of the things that we see very often is that during elections, there are a lot of criminal cases against the opposition. And it's in some countries, you find really serious charges like murder or sedition or so treason charges are quite common. So they will not be found guilty in the end, but they will be very busy in court during the election campaigns. And sometimes it will be difficult for them to stand. So they will have to take a lot of time. So this is also a way in which courts are very often used. And then the law is leveraged in terms of ideas, in terms of campaigns, in terms of symbolism. The symbolism of the law is also leveraged. And that can be in terms of also rewriting curricula, for instance. And it can be sort of in terms of what is illegal. Illegality can often be weaponized in that sense. But, of course, as we were talking about before, this is not only done by the government. So these four arenas, the legislative and constitutional, the administrative, the courts, and the social, if you want, the law is also mobilized in these arenas by political opposition in different ways, but and by civil society. And what we see in these countries and what we show in the book is that actually, or if we look at this over time, the law is and the legal arenas have been the most friendly arenas for the opposition and in terms of fighting back. And it doesn't mean that it's equally easy to use for the opposition, but in comparison with many other arenas, they've been actually quite good. And the courts have, in some cases, been quite robust. And also what we show is that some of these processes, for instance, if the government tries to change the constitution, that creates a lot of space for civil society to mobilize. And this also is, I think that's true everywhere, but where there are a lot of international actors involved as well, it also means that it creates a way to mobilize and space for mobilizing alliances. And I want to just use one example that many of you might know about, but it is quite spectacular actually. And that was in Malawi. In the 2019 elections in Malawi, the sitting president declared victory. It was quite a close election. There were actually 3 relevant candidates. So we won by 30-some points. And it was very close. And as usually happens, the opposition took the case to court. And in this process, what we saw was that the court process became not only the court process, but the court process became a mobilizing tool for the opposition. And there were a lot of street mobilization, and there were a lot of attention on the judges and how this would play out. And it created this sort of coalition in a way between the legal system and the democratic opposition or the political opposition in the country. And which sort of led to, in the midst of COVID actually, first the High Court and then the Court of Appeal to find the election null and void and to demand a re-election. And in June of 2020, a year after the original election, there were fresh elections held, which of course the president could have cancelled due to COVID, but there was a lot of pressure and the president lost and conceded power. So that is actually a very, very spectacular example of how the legal sphere became a very important arena for the opposition in this case. Although it has also been an important arena for the government in other circumstances. So I think I will come there.
Thank you very much, Siri. You're doing a great job of presenting the narrative, and I'm really happy about that. So let's move down, to the middle. And now we're going to have the 2 next presentations. We really deal with various aspects of how gender rights are challenged and sometimes succeeding. And then, so we will start with Vibeke, and then we'll move to Matthew. So 2 presentations on various aspects of this. Yes.
So I will certainly talk to this from perhaps a different angle than chapters within the book, but rather focus on the topic of gender and corruption, and use a recently published article titled "The Women Face a Different Standard." The dynamics or the interplay of gender and corruption in the 2014 presidential elections in Malawi. You'll find a full reference to this article on the project web pages, so the Breaking Bad project webpage, I think. It's a co-authored article together with Boniface Dulani at the University of Malawi and Lise Rakner, need no further introduction, and Lindsay Benstead at Portland State University. So the literature suggests that there's an incumbency advantage in politics. So once you get into office, it increases your chances of staying in power. So in some contexts, this is explained by neo-patrimonialism and also authoritarian tendencies and features. So when power then is personalized and institutions are weak, there are also sort of fewer possibilities of holding the executive to account. And this in turn then increases the possibilities of incumbents sort of personalizing public funds and also engaging in or sort of developing patronage networks. And this then increases incumbency advantage. And this applies really well to Malawi. So both incumbency advantage and corruption have been sort of persistent features of Malawi politics. Incumbents have been disproportionately advantaged at the polls, basically since the reintroduction of multi-party politics in 1994. Yet we have a situation that in 2014, President Joyce Banda, the first female president in Malawi, lost the presidency after only 2 years in power to Peter Mutharika. So the question then is, why didn't the incumbency advantage benefit Joyce Banda? So in this study, we seek to explore gender stereotypes, and we end up arguing that while many Malawian leaders have been linked to corruption scandals, both after Joyce Banda's rule and also before her rule, she was disproportionately punished at the polls, in part due to her gender. And I'll try to sort of give you a bit more context on this argument. So 8 months before the 2014 elections in Malawi, the biggest corruption scandal in the country's history broke, locally dubbed as the Cashgate scandal. So this scandal came to be sort of, put its mark certainly on the election campaign, became the major talking point, and commentators typically sort of linked a possible electoral defeat by Banda to her inability to fight corruption. But then we have still, corruption is endemic in Malawi. So presidents both before Banda and after have been implicated in corruption scandals. And also Cashgate links back to 2005 and the creation of the integrated financial management system in Malawi. So meaning that although the scandal broke on her watch, her predecessor was certainly also implicated, and also her successor was implicated in multiple corruption scandals, but still won the 2019 presidential elections, although it was nullified. But that's not the point. The point is sort of to question whether this suggests that there's a gender bias going on here. So did allegations of corruption hurt Joyce Banda more than they hurt her male predecessors and successor? So we draw on public or national public opinion polls conducted before and after the 2014 elections, and also focus group discussions. And based on our analysis, then we argue that indeed Banda paid a heavier price than male incumbents facing a corruption scandal before and after her. And this is consistent with studies that showing or demonstrating that women holding political office is subjected to more heavy scrutiny than men in public office. And also that when they transgress female gender stereotypes of incorruptibility, they are judged using a harsher standard or a higher standard. So over time then, we have a situation where we're sort of re-election prospects for women involved are reduced. So if you'd like, you can take a look or check our publication out. I'd like to stress before ending this that findings are tentative. More research, of course, is needed to substantiate the claim we make, that women leaders face a different standard than men when linked to allegations of corruption. We also sort of make the point that there is little to be gained from assuming that women's gender somehow guarantees more moral behavior and less corruption, and that effective accountability and also oversight systems are more important than gender when it comes to reducing corruption. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Vibeke. I think the one thing that the most telling quote that we end our article with is when in the focus groups, one person is saying, "This has taught me a lesson. Women shall not be president. They can maximum be vice president." So I think that was just a telling quote about thinking of the lessons learned. Thank you so much, Vibeke. And like I said, you can check out the democraticbacklash.com, and there you can download the article free of charge, at least for another 2 months. Not you. Floor is yours.
So for the surprise.
For the surprise.
For the surprise. So I think what Vibeke just talked about in terms of gender and the penalty that women face politically based on corrupt practices that their male counterparts also engage in is a good jumping off start to get back to sort of the broader backlash discussion, right? So if women are getting punished simply for doing their jobs, right? How are these elites who are actually in charge of ruling and governing implementing the laws that they are? Are they implementing them? And I think earlier we heard about how they can go to the courts or they can make laws that actually entrench male power over women's power. So the Kenyan case, for instance, the 2/3 law that says no government body should be made up of more than 2/3 of one gender, right? It's a new constitution passed in 2010, but male politicians have refused a quorum for this law to actually be passed. Every time they've tried to come into parliament and say, let's have this discussed, male politicians are miraculously absent, for instance. When it's gone to court, the judges have, the Supreme Court judge does have the power to actually ask the president to issue a dissolution of parliament, but that was not invoked until the last Supreme Court judge was about to leave office. And that has still not happened, right? Parliament is still in session until the next election. Parliament is saying, well, this should have been handled by the previous parliament 5 years ago. Time has run out. We do not have to do this anymore, right? So executives are quite clever in how they use their parliamentary majorities to make sure that what they want to happen, which means entrench their own power, stays in place. For groups that are not just women, but other sexual minorities and underrepresented groups, this poses an incredible challenge for them to get their rights in the books, right? So if you think of Ghana now, even though the court in Ghana has said the 21 LGBTQIA+ activists who were arrested in January or February, right, will not face trial, there's still a bill in Parliament that says anyone who is promoting or knowledgeable of any LGBTQIA+ groups or their agenda can receive either 5 to 10 years of prison time, right? These colonial rules about legislating private acts, right, especially when it comes to members of these sexual minority groups, are already in the books. So what we're seeing is that these laws are now being used to expand the terrain around which the government can actually police everyone else who is an ally to these groups, right? So it's not just about the members of the group, but everyone around them. Can they get access to sexual and reproductive rights, healthcare, right? Abortions, for instance, or even HIV medication. If your healthcare worker realizes you're gay and this law is in the books and they report you, what happens to your ability to actually exercise your rights in society in a meaningful way. Right. So for those who push back, the governments usually say, but homosexuality is un-African, right? Or it's un-Christian, right? For the un-African argument, a lot of people say, well, you're ignoring prehistoric, pre-colonial identities of gender and gender's construction and practice, right? When it comes to Christianity, they say the same thing. Well, it's un-Christian, and they say, well, you're ignoring how we've practiced indigenous religion. Alternatively, they also say, well, as I think in the case of Zambia, right, our leaders are God chosen, which gives these societies and their leaders a much stronger base to say, well, it's not just us, it's our communities, right? And politicians are very clever in using these alliances with religious leaders, especially in Pentecostal and evangelical groups, by donating money. It's not just their presence in church and saying, I'm a Christian, right? And I believe this is what the church believes, but co-opting the religious leaders in these organizations. Once you give money, right, it's much more difficult to separate yourself from the political ideology that you are purporting to be separate from as a church institution, right? So the church and state become very much interlinked. Corruption starts breeding into the ideology that is espoused on the pulpit, and then we see the ramifications of it on the streets, right? When people actually take to the streets and try to protest. So for the sexual minorities and women's groups, as Siri mentioned, courts have become very important, right? And we see some movement, but there's variation in the movement that we see. As we heard earlier today, right? You can have this entrenched right to assembly, right? A lot of courts leave that. So for LGBT groups in Kenya, for instance, the right to assembly as an LGBT group, it's held by the Constitution. The courts have said, we will not touch this. But when it comes to questions of you are a gay man asking for gay rights, for instance, to get married, now that's a part where the court will come down hard on, right? Or on the other hand of that, it's like, if it's gender identity, right? If you are trans, the court has been strategically friendly, right? So you can get papers as a trans person, but how that bleeds into sexual orientation, for instance, the courts are very reluctant to actually make a decision on. So there's variation in how the courts are getting involved, and there's very strategic involvement because they also know they're public-facing institutions, right? Simply because the court makes a decision and is free from, if tenure is, for instance, secure, these are still individuals and elites who are embedded in society. Their families and their networks still matter. So they do want to make conscious of how their decisions will affect their own standing as well. But also as an institution that is public facing and dealing with the executive who also controls the purse strings and the legislature as well, they're cognizant of the fact that should they make a decision that goes against the dominant norm, judges might not be appointed, or the funding for the next financial year might be cut significantly, right? So groups can go to the courts and try and demand their rights, but the judges and the way the law is set up also restricts how much development and access they get eventually. And so we need to think about not just about the laws and how they're being used, but who are the elites and the actors and what coalitions are being formed in order to make sure that even though there's a constitution that sounds fantastic, that the leaders are forming coalitions with each other that basically keep groups underrepresented and without access to the rights that they wish to have. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We will tie these various strings together as we go along in the discussion. You should feel free to ask questions. So what I've alluded to when I started presenting the project was that it's not all rights and it's not all aspects of democracy that is as challenged or as hit, in a sense, by the democratic backlash. But we've talked about some of them, the gender bit, the legal institutions, and also LGBT rights and gender rights. And in other aspects that has seen a very significant challenge is actually NGOs, civil society organizations, hit by laws, and also, but where you've seen a sort of resilience and a fight back. And so that is the last aspect of the thematic aspect that I thought we wanted to sort of showcase today. And so for that, we have Lise Marie, who is, as I said, one of the authors of this special issue in global policy that you can also find on our web pages. Download free of charge, 3 articles. But floor is yours, Lise.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking this was actually perfect to sort of end off with what I'm going to say now, because it sort of ties in all together. Because I will do speak to a more general sort of global trend of civil society restrictions and what has been termed like a shrinking space for, or a shrinking civic space, or a closing space for civil society. And then we have been focusing a lot on legal restrictions. Especially like, as you can see, several of the team members in the Breaking Bad project are working on different aspects of this. And then one team member, Kendra Dupuy, has been editing this special issue, which is actually open access. So it's available to everyone from the sites of global policy. It's titled Restricting NGOs from Pushback to Accommodation. So I just wanted to say basically, like, what is the relevance, or like, why did we write this special issue? And then sort of point to some of the new insights that we believe that we're contributing with. So basically, since the mid-2000s, scholars, policymakers, and activists alike have been sounding the alarm bell over the growing tendency of governments across the globe to restrict the ability of civil society groups to form, to operate, to advocate for specific issues, to receive and use funding, especially foreign funding and resources, but also to network with others. And there's many different labels of this phenomenon, and although like these labels like vary in their meaning, their clarity and usefulness, it does seem to be, like, what does seem clear to us is that there is in fact a significant and negative global shift in state-civil society relations, with especially then organizations being increasingly unable to operate as freely as they previously could. So, and when talking about civil society space, I just want to first like draw up an important distinction. So, of course, between like informal and formal civil society actors. When talking about informal, like when talking about civic space in general, it's both like formal institutions and formal civil society organizations, but also more loosely formed networks and individuals and human rights defenders who wanting to raise their voices and speak to a particular cause. But we have been sort of focusing on formal organizations in our issue. So even though the concept of civic space provides a sense of usefulness, and of course we do need to know more about this, it has sort of a lot of implications for research that is just a bit easier to study legal restrictions. In the sense that, of course, so I mean, yes, the special issue is a bit narrower in that sense, because we are focusing on these like new state-imposed legal restrictions and other forms of repression that might impact organizations very specifically. It's because they're more visible as well. They're easily countable. They're easy, like we feel them more in our, in also like the surroundings close to us. So more easily counted and categorized. And then what we have sort of like what's been like most visibly highlighted the last decade has been these especially the restrictions imposed on foreign relations, and on like both foreign and international NGOs, but also on domestic NGOs with foreign connections. So, of course, while governments have always sort of regulated civil society organizations, this new trend has emerged with we're in like an increasing number of civil society restrictions, and we can see that numbers across the globe are increasing. And these legal measures are most typically hampering the ability of organizations to receive and use foreign sources or foreign funded sources and material and resources. And this is limiting their ability to address more politically sensitive issues. So let me just, as we see in this special issue, sort of some of the highlights that we want to, some of the contributions that we want to highlight with this special issue is that we are seeing that there's trends in the clampdown on civil society. We see that there are different types of organizations that are particularly vulnerable to these restrictions. We see that in restrictions, they are changing the balance between civil society and states in home countries. And also we see that these restrictions can actually also alter and change the balance between civil society actors and other civil society actors within the home countries with rival ideologies. Yes. So importantly, the contributions in this issue, in this special issue, they shed light on how organizations can respond to these restrictions and attempt to sort of push back against both state actors, but also other civil society actors. And I want to highlight a few takeaway points. So for instance, the first piece in this special issue, it's a mapping piece where Luc Franzen and Kendra Dupuy, together with some colleagues, they find that between the 1990s and 1990s and 2018, at least 90 countries worldwide have adopted restrictive civil society regulations. And these restrictions are then focused on, like, they cover entry, like entry into sort of how to form and establish civil society organizations, how they operate, and also issues or like areas of work, and what they like, how they do report and what they need to report in their home countries, and also the receipt and use of foreign sourced funding. Also, what they have, what especially this one piece by Kendra and her colleagues is highlighting is how this is affecting transnational linkages and transnational collaborations. They especially sort of examine the effect of these newly imposed legal restrictions on transnational collaborations and transnational advocacy, finding that transnational collaboration, which has had a huge impact on the emergence and functioning of civil society globally. It does continue. I mean, to a large extent, transnational linkages or collaborations disband, but they do also continue, and that's important to know. But the nature and the effect of these collaborations are changed. They're more tempered. So they are basically rendered more elusive, more secretive, more cumbersome, and in other sense, like more or less formal. They also find that civil society, so basically what they're seeing is that it's changing their way of organizational working, how they're working formally and organizationally. What they also find is that civil society organizations working on human rights and labor rights are especially targeted, challenging, so basically are actors that are challenging the existing political economic order. They're challenging the regimes, challenging incumbents. They are especially targeted of these legal restrictions, which actually points to the next sort of insights here, is that on the type of actors being targeted by the restrictive civil society legislations. And that's so basically there's a selective closure of the civic space. So we see that states are selectively, so like they're selectively closing the space for certain civil society actors. We also see that the states can enable the rise of other civil society groups that are more friendly towards the regime, as a part of sort of like a more, it's not a general clampdown on civil society space per se, but more on the selective agents that are pushing the governments on certain areas, so like politically sensitive issues. We also see many actually, several of the articles in the special issue are examining especially exactly what we're discussing here today, the impact of anti-civil society or like anti-rights groups and anti-civil society groups, like anti-rights groups in the civil society, and also how that is infecting or affecting and restricting other types of groups, like for instance LGBT rights and women's rights activism. Yes, which is then again pointing to a third insight, and that is how civil society, I mean, I think as Siri also said in her, it's not only state actors using the legal mechanisms, it's not only state actors sort of shaping the civic space and taking control of it, it's also other civil society groups in society, for instance, anti-right groups that could also themselves contribute to this restricting of civil society actors. There's another really interesting article in the special issue by Ines Posedala and Dominic Pereira, who looks at civil society groups in the form of anti-right groups called The Enemy Within, so looking at how these groups themselves also can influence the restrictions that are being introduced. And sort of, collude and And then, so I think I just wanted to, I think also as the example from Ghana has showed, I mean, even though sort of we see that civic space is determined, the civic space that we see for advocacy is determining what sort of advocacy we see and what form the advocacy takes. I think we also see, especially from this issue and also from this, the Breaking Bad project, is that also the way that actors are engaging in advocacy and their actions and the narratives and the relations they have with political actors also in turn can actually shape advocacy. And the advocacy is in turn shaping the space they have for advocacy. Yeah. I really encourage you to go and read the special issue. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
It's too
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And this is just, I've been trying with this little presentation to show you the width of the project and what we've been doing. I don't know if there are any questions, and if there are, raise your hand. And if there are anyone online, somebody needs to help me out. And then, while we sort that out, I think, don't you wonder how we've been able to do our job and do research during COVID? I bet you wonder. So I am going to ask the panel 2 questions, and that is, first of all, it starts with Caroline. How on earth were you able to do field work during COVID, and how did you solve this issue? So that would be the first question. Original data, how you do that, and then also Siri and who else? I point to you, but anyone else can chip in. What has COVID done to democracy in Africa? So what have we seen? So this is like I'm doing a round of COVID questions, but first. How do you solve when you cannot travel to the field? What do you do, Caroline? What did you do?
You smuggle yourself in. No.
You smuggled yourself in. Okay. Well, apart from that, which is not true.
No, no, of course not. No, I basically what I did was I had this seminar with leading professors on this topic, and I got in contact with one who had a research assistant working in Zambia, and she connected me to her. So then I actually hired a research assistant in Zambia, which it worked really well, although it was because I was recording sermons, so it's quite hard to listen through all the sharing among in the church. But it went
I needed
well.
to talk more about that. I was leading to that question.
Okay.
How sermons become data?
How sermons become data.
This is a real original thing. I think.
I don't know. No, it was actually, I don't know how it happened, but it was one of the few types of data we could get a hold of from afar, I guess, both through YouTube, because some of them are broadcast, and also through having someone working for me in Zambia. And also, I think actually it was your idea. You sent me this article in the beginning, how to use sermons to investigate how religion affects political values. So I was kind of copying,
I forgot that. You
influenced. But it is an original way to connect, or connecting, research, and definitely, I don't think anybody else were analyzing sermons in my master class. No, I don't think anybody has either before me either. Yeah, but it worked. It was hard, but it worked.
So this is now we've heard about how COVID affected Caroline's master thesis, and she came out with an original. Maybe just all of you quickly. There are 2 ways to respond to my question. How do you think COVID has affected Africa's democracy, and how it has affected your work? So you can choose one of the 2, and we'll go around.
There is a lot to say, and of course, Africa is so extremely diverse in this as in so many other questions. But I think it is I mean, there are clear examples of incumbents using COVID as a shield for doing a lot of things that would not be possible to do otherwise. And I think Uganda is clearly a case where we've seen a lot of different actions from the government. But I think, and we see it in many different areas, but I think particularly in the field of LGBT politics, the sort of that it becomes one more excuse for reining in people, keeping them incarcerated for a long time, sort of using the sense of emergency to clamp down on debates and so on. I said my example from Malawi was showing it's not that it's always working, and I think there is also a story of resistance in this context. But I think that we see a lot of examples, and there are many, and I think the fact that there is so little attention focused, international attention. I mean, this is it's not only COVID, there is sort of a long trend of less focus on what's happening to Africa's democracy that you also talked about in the beginning, but it is for sure been, I mean, you can do almost anything. And I think also in Zimbabwe is another case where we see that not only has the pandemic been handled terribly poorly, also in Tanzania, that it was handled really poorly, but also that the government has been able to really close the reins in that context. In terms of research, of course, it also prevents possibilities for doing research, because I mean, particularly when, as we do on most projects, have local partners, they have more possibilities, although they are also restricted, they have more possibilities than us of actually collecting research. And of course, it's interesting to see how when something hits many countries at the same time, it gives us opportunity for seeing what makes the results differ. So we can understand things about societies and about how social systems and political systems function by looking at how this shock, which was sort of course not uniform, but how it has affected. So for instance, how vulnerable groups like sex workers and LGBT people have been affected by differently in different countries is something that we have done work on in some projects.
So Vibeke, you work on gender violence, and you have a project on gender violence. It's really hard to do because of getting started. Do you think are women, from very basic so far, what you can see has COVID affected gender violence, or are women more affected? Do you see, is there any sign of a gendered effect of COVID?
Honestly, I can't sort of say any definite about. I don't have the data to rely on to say anything definite about that at the moment. We are still in the early stages. We have nearly finished a survey to roll out. But given the COVID situation in Uganda, but also other African countries, there's this uncertainty as to when this will be possible to do. So that's one aspect of it. But we are, we should definitely try to include the COVID aspect in the survey, I think. And I'm not sure we haven't really thought about that yet, so we should do that.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to put on my glasses.
Right.
Okay. So there's a question.
Yep.
Now it disappeared on me. No, it says one wonders whether the lack of focus on African democracy is part of a national trend globally. Countries are increasingly interested in their own affairs. COVID has arguably made us more inward. Yeah, that's a comment.
Amen.
Is there a question there? Yeah, I agree, Michael, but I think just a second, there's, I cannot hear you.
You can come in and ask.
You can come in and ask, and then we have a question.
Briefly mention, China.
You come in.
Asian influence in Africa, but none of you really addressed the ways in which it might be affecting either human rights, women's rights, or more broadly speaking, democracy. So I don't know whether any of you have anything that you want to share with us.
Yeah. I can do that, but
Yeah, you
you
can
want
do
to
that, you
respond
can do
first?
that.
Anyone else wants to respond to this?
We can all.
Yeah. So this is thanks for a great question, and I still kind of, it's almost like there's a question, Malcolm, that I'm trying to figure out, but I'll try to respond to you too. So this is one of the things that we are really concerned about, because what we are concerned about is this shift from a kind of an focus on how funding democracy, funding human rights organizations, funding media organizations, funding liberal democracy. And when what happens to these associations and these initiatives when that dies out? And that is we do see a clear shift in. I think one of the things that's been really interesting for us is how the issue of LGBTQ and the sort of politicization has really come across in all our case studies, from the more democratic to the least democratic. And this is the case where Africa is sort of a front runner. And what has become really interesting is how this issue has become more and more politicized, and it's been more the less kind of donor presence there is. So the one country where this issue is sort of still, where LGBT laws are, LGBT people and organizations are relatively protected, is actually Malawi. And Malawi is the case of our case studies, the country that has the most stable kind of 1990s relationship to the international partners. There's actually quite a large governance program, and all the European and US embassies have governance programs. Whereas all this sort of like the case of Zambia, where they pulled out, and Zambia became a middle-income country now with the hugest debt ever. And then the main partner is China. This is the same case for Zimbabwe. China has become the main partner, and then we see these issues are much of they're not really they don't become salient issues, and the organizations that are actually quite dependent on this kind of funding, and that have a lot of capacity, and that also have been, these organizations have very high capacity people with with high education, and they've been quite important for challenging democratic backlash, challenging autocratic government. They have moved to other fields. They move to health, or they move to something, whatever there is funding for. And this is really clearly affected the sort of the capacity, and the intellectual capacity of civil society. So we do see that this is this changing international relations are quite important. And that kind of, Malcolm, links to your comments. I'm kind of making it into a question now, because it's true for, we cannot in this book, we will not say that there is a sort of wholesale backlash or a sort of a democratic backsliding in Africa. We're saying that there's backlash, there's stagnation, there's resilience. The one thing that is quite clear is that there is a backlash against democracy from international donors. The Western donors have sort of retreated from focusing on and funding democracy, and that has huge implications for the kind of build up of capacity, and for having sort of highly educated people challenging government. So that is actually that is a very important element. And I think Malcolm, you're right. This is all us retreating, and COVID has made every country in the world becoming more inward-looking and nationalistic, and to be honest, we're all losing out from that because this pandemic is not over, and it's not over before everyone is vaccinated, and that is so. We're going to be 20 people in learning exchanges next year as well if we don't do anything about this. So I do agree with you on that one. Anyway, more comments. We have 5 more minutes, and Siri has, and anyone else with the final word, but Siri.
Just to follow up. I think it is not only COVID. I mean, this started long before.
Yeah.
So I think it is. There are many elements to this, and I think so. I think one, of course, is that there was more. I mean, in a way, more competition among donors that were with China in particular, and some cases also India coming in, particularly China, but also, and then in a way, easing the leverage that the Western donors had in a lot of issues, but also a lot of long-term lack of interest. And I think that the former US administration also made a big difference on many of these issues, because a lot of African NGOs, for instance, could not use sort of leverage from the US on their governments, which had been a tactic, not least among sexual and reproductive rights related organizations. So I think, but this is much longer. So I think COVID has for sure accelerated this nationalist trend, but it is, I mean, we see it in migration issues, we see it on so many fields that we are becoming more protectionist, more selfish in a way, in our way, at least more self-centered. And I think that if you think about African leaders, there is, I guess everywhere, but particularly clear that there is this double dialogue. So there is this dialogue that you have one way of, one rhetoric towards the outer society and donors, and then you have another one to your own constituency. And sometimes, I mean, it's fascinating, people who do analyze speeches, that they're very different if they're in English or in the vernacular, and that you have these, and in a way, the donor audience has become less important. So I think that is also something that we see also, that there is less pressure on the sort of more local, the way of speaking to, which is a way of, I mean, democracy is also populism, obviously. You speak to your constituency, you speak to beliefs and prejudices and everything. And I think there's also something about many of these trends that sort of make that less problematic. And then there's a lot of learning across regions and countries.
I think one of the things is sort of also the relationship with China has allowed more secrecy and less accountability,
Yes,
right? Because you cannot see through the transaction. So then that benefits corruption, which is just one of the main hindrances to the backlash, right? So I think that's probably one way.
Guys, thank you so much for listening to us, whether you're here or there, and thanks. I mean, look at these people. What a joy to have been the project director of this one, or what is it called? PI. Guys, you always shine. Thank you so much. And let's go and thank you.